Welcome to the Agronomy and Farm Management Podcast. I'm Bruce.
And I'm Josh, and we're your farm management hosts. Let's get started.
Well, Josh, we've rolled into November, and by golly, the next holiday that we are going to enjoy with friends and family up my way is going to be Thanksgiving, and that is certainly going to include food on the menu. And I bet, Josh, you have one of your favorite foods that you're hoping for Thanksgiving.
Bruce, my favorite holiday is Thanksgiving by far, 100%. People say it's Christmas. It's not. It's Thanksgiving. Here's why. We have probably 12 different types of pie at Thanksgiving. And if you think I eat every single piece, you're right. I eat probably a whole pie just on Thanksgiving, whether that's peanut butter, apple, blueberry, anything. We have it all. I gain probably 5 pounds. I waddle to the couch, I lay down, and then I go ahead and I sleep the rest of the day. What about you, Bruce? What's your favorite food on Thanksgiving?
Oh, I do love our turkey. So we have a local source that has a whole boneless turkey. And so the whole thing frozen goes into the oven. And in 6 hours, it goes from a solid frozen turkey, whole, no bones, has white meat, dark meat, all included, into this delicious, juicy, wonderful wrapped kind of turkey, not loaf. It's still whole meat. It's not processed. It's processed to remove the bones, but so much delicious spices and flavorings inside there. So good. The part that I love though, Josh, is not just the day of. My family has a tradition of making a turkey casserole afterwards. And then, of course, turkey sandwiches, like a grilled bacon and turkey, almost like a grilled cheese, but with bacon and turkey on it after a few days after. So really enjoy those things. And we've already celebrated one Thanksgiving because I have parents that go to Florida for the winter. And so we had to do Hollow Thanks Christmas already as one on one side of our family. And it was really enjoyable to really have everybody together. And for us, that's the main part.
There's nothing better than leftovers and an OSU victory over Michigan after Thanksgiving. We haven't experienced that for a couple of years, but
That's
we're
right.
looking forward to it.
I agree. Well, Josh, we have a great guest with us today. We have Michael Langemeier, and Michael and I were able to go be at a conference across the Midwest for some Ag Outlooks topics this past summer. And I got to know Michael a little bit better, and I thought this is a great place for Michael to really share some of his expertise here in the state of Ohio. And just to give everybody a little bit of a background, Michael Langemeier is the Director of Cropping Systems for the Center for Commercial Ag in the Department of Agricultural Economics at Purdue University. Michael's extension and research interests include ag finances and cost of production. He participates in an international cost of production benchmarking network that compares corn, soybeans, and wheat break-even prices across countries. Michael has written numerous articles pertaining to financial analysis, crop budget, leasing principles, cash rents, you name it, land values, transition planning. Farm management is right in his wheelhouse. So, Michael, thanks so much for being our guest today. It's great to have a Purdue Boilermaker on our podcast.
Glad to be here.
Let's start off with a question for Michael. This pertains to some of your recent work, and it's really timely because you've written recently on the 2024-2025 financial downturn. And this is the farm financial downturn. Who is the most vulnerable? And so this article was well written, and I think it really pulls in some of the key factors that are facing farmers today. And Michael, could you describe the factors that you are seeing that are influencing this farm financial downturn of 2024 and into 2025?
Before I get into the specific factors, we could see this coming for a while. During COVID and the aftermath of COVID, our input costs increased rather dramatically. And we've had some relief in terms of fertilizer and fuel prices, but the break-even prices for corn, soybeans, and other crops is still really high compared to the pre-COVID days. And so you combine that relatively high break-even prices for corn, for example, even if you had trend yields in 24, you're probably looking at break-even prices that could be as high as $5 or slightly over. Obviously, that's a lot higher than the current cash prices. So it's a combination of those high break-even prices and then the rather large drop in crop prices that we've seen in 24. creates a situation where net returns are probably going to be as low as they've been since the 2007 ethanol boom started. I think they could be as low as some of the net returns that we saw. And here I'm talking primarily crop producers from 2014 to 2019, which was not a particular great time for crop producers, during that 2007 to 24 period.
So, Michael, when we're looking at a farm manager that's feeling kind of stressed, they may be hesitant to measure some of those financial stresses and their vulnerability. Numbers can be scary once they're kind of looking you right in the face. How are you going to convince them to look at that financial stress and the vulnerability to be measured?
Two things I would really recommend for everybody, even if they don't have an accrual income statement, which a lot of people don't. You need an accrual income statement to really calculate the profit margin. So if you don't have that, let's move to something we do have, we're more likely to have as a starting point. One is make sure you have a very accurate balance sheet. One of the metrics you're going to use to measure financial stress is debt to asset. This includes current and non-current assets compared to current and non-current debt. And so if you have a really high debt to asset ratio, that's going to increase the vulnerability. I think that's kind of an obvious point. The other thing that a person could look at if they have the cash flow information is do some scenario analysis or look at some scenarios using different prices and see if they're going to have trouble repaying debt. That's what the lender is going to do when you look at your 24 data. So get a jump start on that and go ahead and think about that yourself. Am I going to have enough cash flow to repay my land loan, to repay my machinery loan, to repay my current debt obligations that I took out maybe in April or May? And so that's some things you can look at with farm information. Most farms would have cash flow information and a balance sheet.
Recently in Ohio, we finished our ag lender seminar schools, and one of the comments made is that debt isn't necessarily bad. It's debt becomes bad when you can't cash flow it. And so a lot of businesses, farm businesses and others have debt. And so it becomes a problem when we can't cash flow it. And so, Michael, how is measuring financial stress different than calculating probability of default?
This is a really important question, so I'm glad you asked this. The probability of default is really looking at the very high debt to asset ratios and saying, it's not possible to make my debt payments. And so that's really looking at bankruptcy. That's not what we're talking about today. What we're talking about today is vulnerability, vulnerability to financial stress. And it's a starting point to see if in the future we're going to have problems repaying debt. And also, in addition to repaying debt, we're going to have problems replacing our assets in a timely fashion. So that's what we need. We really need cash flow for, to pay ourselves, but also to pay the lender, make sure we're making principal payments, and to replace assets. And so it's a lot different than looking at the probability of default. When you look at financial stress, I usually look at, like I said, a debt to asset ratio. Farms are vulnerable if that debt to asset ratio, once it gets above 70%. Now, personally, talking to a lot of farms, they're uncomfortable once it gets above 50%, because that means your creditors own more of your assets than you do. But from a vulnerability standpoint, a financial stress standpoint, most ag finance professionals think of a really high debt to asset ratio, something above 70%. Now, that's with measuring assets at market value. That's very important to keep that in mind, which most farms do. They'll put their land values at market value in the balance sheet. They'll put their machinery at market value. The thing we look at for financial stress is the profit margin. Is the profit margin positive? And that's why we wrote this article primarily, is we think there's going to be low profitability this year. And if you have a combination of low profitability in 24 and 25, combining that with a farm that has a high debt to asset ratio, which is not that common today because we have pretty strong balance sheets, but there is some farms in that situation. Their back is up against the wall. If you have that high debt to asset ratio and then a negative profit margin, that's going to be problems. And so we wanted to get an early start on this to see what financial stress was in 24 and then recompute in 25 and 26 and so on, because I think this low corn price is probably going to stay with us for a while, unfortunately. And so that was the primary motivation for the article. I want to talk a little bit more about the profit margin. Essentially, what you're looking at there is my net farm income plus my interest paid larger than my owner withdrawals. And so that's kind of that's kind of the relationship you look for. If the owner withdrawals are larger than your net farm income from an accrual standpoint and the interest paid, then you're going to have a negative profit margin. And even in 23, if we look at University of Minnesota FinBin data, if you look at crop farms in 23, the average profit margin was 7.5%. That's down considerably from what it was in the previous 4 years. In 24, we're probably looking at something that's negative on average. And so again, that was the primary motivation for working on this article.
So for our listeners, before we get any farther, this article is actually linked in our description. So be sure to click the description and find that article. Michael, where do you find the trend data for your research indicating the changes?
Primarily use University of Minnesota FinBin data because it's publicly available. And I know Ohio State also has some farms participating in that program. So I think that's positive. I'm glad you do. I think it's a very useful way to analyze data. But that's where I'm really obtaining the data for this article is that FinBin database that's housed at the Center for Farm Finance at the University of Minnesota. But also, when you look at low profit margin, I was looking at the Illinois Farm Business Farm Management data the other day. Their profit margin for 23 was actually lower than the FinBin profit margin for crop farms. The FinBin data was 7.5%. The data for Illinois was close to zero. And so already in 23, we had some profitability problems. And I think 24 is going to be considerably worse in 23, even if you had good yields. As we were talking about before this podcast, unfortunately, there's some parts of the Eastern Corn Belt, i.e. Ohio, where the yields were not very good. And so that's going to make a particularly difficult year in terms of profitability.
Yeah, Michael, I agree. I keep hearing the phrase double whammy for Ohio on price and production. So, Michael, help everyone understand this terminology of operating profit margin ratio. How do you like to explain it, and how is it calculated? What is the number actually measuring, and any kind of trends that you see with operating profit margin ratio?
Okay, let me give this a stab here. It's not the same as net cash farm income, so that's what makes it a little bit more complicated. Essentially, the net farm income is an accrual measure, and the main accrual adjustment is related to the revenue. And so essentially, the way to think about the net farm income, this is a simple way to think about it. You take your cash income and you adjust it for inventories. And so if your ending inventory is bigger than your beginning inventory, that adjusts your cash income up. And vice versa. And you take this accrual adjusted revenue and you subtract your cash expenses along with depreciation, and you can come up with this accrual net farm income. And so I've done some articles in the past that walk people through that. So there's some articles on my Center for Commercial Agriculture website that goes from a Schedule F balance sheet over to accrual net farm income. It's really not that difficult. The main thing is adjusting for those changes in inventories, particularly crop inventories, because we like to sell a lot of our crop in the next year. So 24 crops sold in 25, you need to make an adjustment for that. If you look at trends in the profit margin over time, like I said, the 23 profit margin was relatively low. We're coming off two really, really good years, 21 and 22. The average profit margin was close to 30% using the FinBin data. That's absolutely incredible. That's through the roof. In fact, 21 was probably one of the better years since 1974. 1973, 1974. So it's been a long time since we had a year that good. That's why the financial stress is not as bad as you might think it is with the low profitability, because the balance sheets are really strong. We come off that 21 and 22 at both the current portion of the balance sheet. Your current ratio is pretty strong for a lot of farms, but also the non-current portion is relatively strong. And so that's the good news when it comes to talking about financial stress.
So, Michael, I think we've already touched on this once, but let's go back to debt to asset ratio. How is debt to asset ratio different and helpful to measure financial stress?
Yes, essentially the debt to asset ratio, most balance sheets that I've seen that farmers give their lender calculate this, and the lender is going to calculate it. You take your current farm debt and you add to that any non-current farm debt. The current debt is usually, like we're talking about here, operating notes. You have an operating note on your crops you took out in the spring that you hopefully can repay this fall. So you add that along with any notes you have for machinery, buildings, and land. So you add up all the debt, and then you're dividing by all of your assets. The current assets would be primarily crop inventories, cash, prepaids, prepay expenses, fertilizer seed during the year. That's actually a current asset on the balance sheet. And then the non-current assets, of course, what is the value of your machinery, buildings, and land? And land, it's extremely important that you put an accurate value on that because for a lot of farms, that's their major asset. And I always tell people we pretty much live and die on land values in production agriculture. If land values are relatively weak, they're not right now, but if land values are relatively weak, the balance sheet doesn't look very good. Right now, land values are pretty strong, and so that's really helping the balance sheet. And so that's essentially how we calculate this debt to asset ratio.
And Michael, many of the factors that you've described influencing the farm financial downturn are really external to the farm. These are not controlled by that farm manager that's there on the farm making decisions every day. How does the farm manager manage this type of risk within the areas of things they have control over?
Well, one of the things that you can do, and I'm preaching to the choir with you guys, but I'm not preaching to the choir necessarily with the entire farm audience, is one of the things we have to do is measure, quantify profitability both at the enterprise level and at the whole farm level. Here we're talking at the whole farm level. And so if you're on a farm that really doesn't have good financial records, good financial statements, by all means, that's a very important thing you need to do as we're entering into a tighter period here. I would also say it's also important to do that in terms of break-even prices. If you don't have break-even prices by farm, even by field, I would strongly encourage you to do that because one of the sayings that the engineers use a lot, I agree with them totally. If you can't measure something, you can't control it. And so you're not going to know if you're a high cost producer for corn, for example, to see if you need to make some changes if you don't calculate your break-even price. I've seen break-even prices for 24 anywhere from 450 to 550. That obviously there's a lot of difference there. All of them don't look very good compared to cash prices, but there's a lot of difference between 450 than 550. And so you really need to hone down, try to measure profitability and cost of production both at the enterprise level, corn enterprise, soybean enterprise, hog enterprise, whatever you have on your farm, as well as the entire farm. That's really one of the ways that you can really think about this. I also encourage people, and again, you don't need accrual financial statements to do this. The lender really focuses on repayment measures. And these measures look at, do I have enough profit to repay principal and interest payments? I like to take that one step further. And 24, the answer is going to be no to the question I'm going to ask here for most people. But do I have enough income in a typical year or 24 or long run? You can ask both ways. Do I have enough income to not only make my principal payments, repay debt in a timely fashion, but do I have enough money to replace assets? In the long run, a farm has to be able to do both. You have to be able to make principal payments and interest payments in a timely fashion, but you also have to have enough earnings there so that if you need to replace your tractor in 3 years, you have some funds available to do that. And so I really encourage farms to calculate the same repayment measures that lenders use. And that's basically two of them. One's looking at repaying principal and interest payments. The other one's looking at repaying principal and interest payments and saving enough money or having enough money to replace machinery. And again, you can do those measures. It's better to do them with accrual net farm income, but you could do those measures just using cash income and expenses in the balance sheet.
Michael, we've covered a lot of ground in the last 20 minutes. What are some final thoughts you have for our audience?
Well, I want to talk a little bit about the farm types that are particularly vulnerable. Obviously, with your double whammy, you were talking about, Bruce, that's certainly going to increase financial stress. But also in general, if you're looking across the Corn Belt, one of the farms that I'm really worried about, and these aren't necessarily small farms, if a farm leases most of their ground, and here we're talking 90% or more, which there is some farms in that category, there's two problems there. One problem is they probably don't have the land asset base to fall back on. Because they're leasing most of their ground, they don't have as strong a balance sheet, particularly at the non-current side, as farms that don't lease as much ground. The other thing is, this might not just be a 1 year low income, and then we're back to a really strong price. If you look at the long run futures price, I don't want to be Dr. Doom here, but if you look at the long run futures price for corn and soybeans, it doesn't look like they're going to increase anytime soon. And so you have to, again, you have to kind of paint a scenario of what you're going to do if corn prices stays in that 425 to 450 corridor. Obviously, you're going to try to reduce your break-even prices all possible, but you may need to rethink about leasing some of the ground that you have. If you're losing a lot of money on some of that ground that you're leasing, you may have no choice but to give some of that ground up and focus on the ground where your cash flow is much stronger. I know it's very, very difficult to do, but that group is vulnerable. The other group, sometimes is the same group. I'm also really worried about farms with relatively less experience. And here I'm talking about younger farms that are either completely standing on their own, or they have a separate farm from their other family members, and so they're kind of separate from the older generation in terms of their farm. Because they have less experience, they probably have a weaker balance sheet again. The non-current assets probably aren't there as they would be on an established farm. And then the other farm that's really obvious is high debt to asset ratios. And even though that's not common right now, nothing like we saw in the early 1980s. We saw a lot more debt in the early 1980s and in the early 2000s, quite frankly, than we're seeing right now. But what happens when you have a series of years that with low returns is the debt to asset ratio climbs. So I'm worried that there's going to be some people in the next 2 or 3 years where the debt to asset ratio is going to climb. That makes them very vulnerable. Then they're really heading towards that situation where they not only have low profit, they also have a high debt to asset ratios. And so that's why it's so important to calculate the measures we're talking about here. I know you guys have programs associated with financial analysis, financial statements. It's so important to try to measure this profit margin, debt to asset ratio, and figure out where you're at. I think a lot of people are going to be pleasantly surprised that their debt to asset ratio is still pretty solid, and even though profitability in 24 is not too good, that they have good working capital. But you need to know that to see where you're at, because you want to get ahead of the curve. If it looks like you're not going to be able to make some payments, you want to know that earlier rather than later, so you can communicate with your lender in a different fashion than it being a surprise. Going to the lender says, "Well, it looks to me like you can't make your debt payment." You don't want to spring that on him or act like you didn't know that this was going to be a problem. So just to improve your communication with the people you deal with, specifically lenders, it's important to know where you're at financially.
Thank you very much, Michael. For those listeners that are interested in the Ohio program for measuring farm profitability, we invite you to look into the Ohio Farm Business Analysis and Benchmarking Program at farmprofitability.osu.edu.
Hey, podcasters. What you just heard may have you concerned about your financial or emotional stress. If you ever need to talk to someone, know that there's always people willing to listen. You can call and text 988 to 24/7 hotline to talk to somebody, and it can remain completely anonymous. If you want more ideas or resources, check out go.osu.edu/farmstress for a more comprehensive support guide.
Thanks for listening today.
For more information about farm management tips, be sure to check out the Farm Office at farmoffice.osu.edu.